Hello. Hello and welcome to Dominions 5, Warriors of the Faith. And my third attempt at trying to record this video. Hopefully you can actually hear me this time. Anyway, I returned after nearly a decade to show you one of my favorite games of all time. This is going to be a beginner's guide where I just kind of describe how to play the game and really go into depth in my thoughts as I'm playing the game. We're going to be doing a single-player campaign where I play as the nation Early Age Relay. But before we do that, we need to get into some of the basic concepts of Dominions so you can kind of understand what's happening and better appreciate things. If that doesn't sound interesting to you, you can probably skip this video. I'll probably be going over some of the concepts that I go over in this video later on as I'm playing, but this should be a good primer for you if you want to get a better understanding of what the setting is like and how the mechanics work. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to give you kind of an idea of what Dominions is like. And I think the most direct modern comparison that I can make is between Dominions and Warhammer Total War. And that Warhammer Total War is a game about a bunch of fantasy races all battling it out on a campaign map, and when the armies clash into each other on the campaign map, then you zoom into a kind of battle view. In that way, Dominions is a lot like Total War, but that's really where the similarities end. This game is extremely deep, which you might not initially think when I go over the mechanics, but the layers of strategy here is really something you can only appreciate after playing it for a while. Anyway, let's get into the setting. So the setting of Dominions 5 is you are taking on the role of a pretender god who is battling it out with other pretender gods over the right to basically have complete dominion over the earth, or whatever world that you're fighting over. And each of your pretender gods is in charge of a nation, and the nations in this game are one of the main draws. All of them are extremely unique and just very cool. They're all based, well, not all of them, but most of them are inspired by real-world mythology or religions, and with a healthy dose of Dungeons and Dragons thrown in. Now, if that sounds interesting, you'll probably like this game. Another mechanic that we need to go over is the age system. In Dominions 5, there are 3 different time periods that you can play in. And depending on which one you play in, the available factions or nations that you can play as change drastically. Now, in the early ages, it's near not the dawn of time, but it's the dawn of civilization, I should say. And magic is very powerful in the early ages. There are lots of extremely powerful mages slinging crazy powerful spells around in the early age. Technology is not particularly advanced. Only a few nations have access to iron armor and weapons, and only one has access to steel. In the Middle Ages, things are changing. Technology has advanced. Some of the old races are in decline. Humanity is rapidly emerging as the dominant species on the planet. And technologies like iron are now available to most nations. Mages aren't quite as powerful as they used to be. Some of them are, but they're much rarer and more expensive, or generally have some kind of drawback. In the late ages, technology has advanced significantly. Pretty much everyone has access to iron. Lots have access to steel. Crossbows are a thing. Cavalry is ubiquitous. Heavy armor is readily available. But magic has dwindled significantly. There are very few powerful mages left in the late ages, and the resources required to cast spells and perform crazy rituals are much less common in the late ages. And so the mages that are left are, well, they're going to desperate measures. Generally blood and death magic, but we're not going to get into that. Anyway, that's how the age system works, and I'm going to give you a quick example of how a nation might change throughout the ages. And I think the perfect example of that... Oh, sorry, when you first load things, it's a little slow. Okay, and I think a perfect example of that is Agartha, the Pale Ones. Now, Agartha... well, let's just read the nation description real quick. In the dark caverns, under the roots of the earth, a strange kind of one-eyed humanoids has evolved. Untouched by the sun, they have become known to humans as the Pale Ones. The Pale Ones are gifted with perfect dark vision and gills and inhabit underwater rivers and lakes as well as cavernous halls. Pale Ones never stop growing, and Ancient Ones can grow to huge proportions. The wisest of the Ancient Ones are known as the Oracles, priest mages of great power. The Oracles are gathered in a great cavernous hall where they divine the fate of the Pale Ones. So, the Pale Ones are a race of subterranean, cyclopean, amphibious giants. And they're pretty cool. So their thing is all their troops are amphibious. They're all giants. I guess you wouldn't have a direct comparison. Let me show you humans. So this is Ermor, which are heavily inspired by the Roman legions. This is the size of what a normal human looks like. And then you look at Agartha, you can see that they're much larger. Anyway, so in the dawn of civilization, the Pale Ones are very prevalent. They're all alive and well and powerful. They have mages, basically, and they're trying to take over the surface world. So, in canon, that doesn't go so well for them. So let's go to the Middle Ages and see what's happened to Agartha. So immediately you'll notice that most of the giants are gone. There are a few left, especially here, but you'll notice that the recruitable roster now includes a lot more humans. And this is because, according to canon, the Agarthans lost the first War of Ascension very badly. Not only did they lose, they also broke open a ancient seal that was housing a bunch of dead gods that they were in charge of protecting, and they kind of completely destroyed their civilization in the process. Now, in the Middle Ages, humans have moved underground, and the humans revere the Pale One giants, so much so that they make loads and loads of statues of them. And if you look up here at the name of the Middle Age Agartha, Golem Cult, you can kind of imagine what they do with those statues. So in Dominions, this recruitable roster down here is not everything that you have available to you. Many nations have rituals and spells and summons and stuff that they can use. In particular, Agartha in the Middle Ages can reanimate statues into very powerful golems that they use for war. Now let's see how they're doing in the late ages. Okay. So all the giants are dead now. Not all of them are dead, but they're so rare that you can't even recruit them anymore. They're not on your roster. In order to get them, you need to perform rituals or have recruit rare heroes or whatnot. And not only are all the Pale Ones dead, all of the statues that they used to worship and animate have all been destroyed because they used them as war golems, and war golems tend to be destroyed in wars. So all the statues are gone. Almost all of the Pale Ones themselves are gone. So all that's left are corpses. So Agartha in the late ages is known as Agartha Gatonian Dead. So as you might imagine, they focus on death magic now and necromancy. Basically, Late Age Agartha revives the old corpses of the Pale Ones and uses them in war. Kind of an interesting development there. Not only that, but they've all of the Agarthan humans have been living underground for so long that they've actually developed dark vision. They can see in the dark, and they all use weapons that are suited to close quarters, cramped corridor fighting. Almost all of them use short swords. So you can kind of see how a nation progresses from early to late. Now, Agartha probably changes the most out of all of the nations, but it's interesting. Anyway, we're going to get into the mechanics now. So, we're going to take a look at the nation that we're going to be playing in this tutorial series, and that is Early Age Relay, Time of Aboleths. Now, I'm not going to get into the details right now. We're going to do that in the next few videos. We're just going to go over the mechanics as to how this game works. So, let's look at one of our basic infantry units, the Slave Guardian. And I'm just going to go over the stats and how the stats function in this game. So, first off, we're going to look at the top row here, which is what it costs to recruit this unit. So we have gold, obviously how much it costs, how much the unit is being paid to recruit. Resources is a representation of how much raw materials you need in order to make this unit's equipment. So the more heavily armed and armored, the more resources they will cost. And recruitment points is sort of a representation of the effort that it takes to find, recruit, and train this unit. So 10 is about the average for a human for all of these. The average human takes 10 gold to recruit, 10 resources to arm, and 10 recruitment points to train. So you can see here, this particular unit has little below average price to recruit, little above average resources, and quite below average recruitment points because he is a slave. But like I said, we'll get into that later. So moving on, hit points, self-explanatory. Pretty much 10 is pretty much the average for all of these stats, with a few exceptions like size or encumbrance. But so you can see this Slave Guardian has above average hit points. 12 hit points is actually pretty good for a human-sized unit. And speaking of size is the next one we're going over. Size 2 is what the average human is. Size 2 is human-sized. Size 3 is horse-sized. Size 1 is like goblin or smaller-sized. And it goes all the way up to size 6. And what size means, it primarily determines how many of this unit can fit in one grid square on the battlefield, which is very important, but it's a little complicated for what we're doing right now. Suffice to say, 3 humans can fit in every grid unit on the battlefield. Protection is a representation of the armor of the unit. Now we have basic natural protection of 2, so that's just a representation of his scales. He's a scaly boy. And armor value 10, which is kind of averaged of all the different pieces of armor that he's wearing. So he's got an armor value on his head of 10 and an armor value on his body of 10. So that's because he's wearing shell armor and a shell cap. And then it adds them all together, and he has a total protection value of 12. Really, protection, it depends on where they're hit. Like, if they hit an unarmored part of their body, then this protection isn't going to protect them, which is another reason why it's good to wear a helmet, kids. Anyway, moving on from there, magic resistance is basically your will save. It's how difficult it is to affect you with certain kinds of magic. So 10 is completely average. Morale is another self-explanatory thing. Basically, how easy it is for this unit to hold its ground and not run away. 10 is the average. This one has 7, which is very bad. And the reason it has such low morale is because he is a slave. And slaves do not have high morale. Okay, so strength is how much damage that they deal. And strength is modified by the weapon that they're wielding. As you can see here, we've got a bone trident. It deals a damage of 5. And then we add our 11 strength to that. Which does not equal 18. So I'm not sure what's going on there. I'm sure there's something that I'm missing here. Anyway, let's find something where it actually does equal. So strength 12 plus the stone spear damage of 2 equals 14. Okay, so that actually makes sense. I don't know why this says 18. There must be something going on here that I'm missing. Oh, it's a two-handed weapon. That's why. Right. So anyone who's played D&D knows that if you use if you hold a weapon in two hands, then you get to multiply your strength a little bit when you use it. So that's what's going on there. Okay, attack skill is how easily you can hit things, and defense skill is how easily you can dodge things. Pretty self-explanatory. I'm using that term a lot. Sorry. Precision is how good you are at using ranged weapons. This guy doesn't have a ranged weapon, so that doesn't matter. Combat speed is how fast they move on the battle map. Map move is how fast they move on the campaign map. Encumbrance is how quickly they get tired while fighting, and encumbrance is usually affected by the armor that they're wearing. So you can see here, this shell armor has an encumbrance rating of 1, and the shell cap doesn't have any. So he has a base encumbrance of 3, and it's modified by 1 by his armor. So he has 4 encumbrance, which means every round that he's in combat, he will gain 4 fatigue. And fatigue goes up from 0 to 100. If you reach 100, then you become exhausted and you cannot do anything anymore. You basically pass out. So every time he fights in combat, he gains 4 fatigue. And as fatigue goes up, your defense and your attack skill start to go down because you're getting tired. Your defense degrades faster than your attack, but well, you get it. Age is how old the unit is. If you look at the thing here, the max age is not, they won't drop dead the second that they hit 500, or the second that they hit their max age, but they will become old at that point, and they will start receiving penalties and eventually get diseased and die. Now, Atlanteans, which is what this thing is, that's his race. It doesn't say that, but I just know that. Atlanteans live for a very, very long time. So we don't need to worry about age on these guys. But some nations, like Abyssia is a perfect example. Like, look at this guy. He's 28, max age 33. So these guys get old really fast. They do not live very long. In fact, this guy is already old. You can see here. So he gets all of these penalties here. And every winter, old units have a chance of contracting a disease and just slowly dying. But that's... Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Where was I? Right. So XP is... units gain experience. They can level up a little bit and get slight improvements to their stats. Yada, yada, yada. We're going to look at equipment now. So, he is equipped with a bone trident, which, as we said, is a two-handed weapon, deals 5 piercing damage. Different types of weapon damage have different effects. We're not going to get into those now. It has 0 effect on attack, which means if this was a 1, he would get like a +1 to his attack while using it, or if it was negatives, it would do the same. It has a defense rating of 1, which means his defense is modified by 1 when he uses it. So you can see here, weapon defense modifier +1, and armor and shield defense modifier is -1. That's because his armor gives him a -1 defense value. So basically equipment comes into play a lot here. And speaking of equipment, let's talk a little bit of how protection works. So basically, if this guy stabbed someone and they hit them, and they say he's fighting a mirror matchup, someone equipped just like him. This weapon would deal 18 damage, and let's say he stabbed him in the chest, and the chest armor has a protection of 10. It's literally just a simple math equation. You subtract 10 from that damage, and he would take 8 damage. 8 damage would go through. Now, that's a big simplification in Dominions. Basically, every single thing is modified by what's called a Dominion random number, which is 2 6-sided dice. And both sides roll that. But that's getting a little complicated. Basically, just know that there's some random variance involved, and it can get extreme random sometimes if you're extremely particularly lucky or not lucky. But around half of the damage would be negated by the armor that he was wearing, which is good. And obviously, the higher protection that you have, the more noticeable that effect is. And that's basically how the basic stats work in this game. Let's look at a commander now. Now, commanders have some unique characteristics, particularly leadership. So this guy has a leadership of 80, which means he can command 80 men, or soldiers, or yeah. And there's also leadership thresholds. Like every 40 points, I think, of leadership basically conveys morale bonuses, and also allows him 80 leadership, I think, is the threshold for formations. So he can actually put units that he commands into formations. Magic leadership. Let's see. This Aboleth, for example, has 145 magic leadership, and that's how many magical beings that he can command. So there are lots of things in this game that aren't normal. Like, for example, this Lobo Guard here, he is a magical being. And the reason he is a magical being is because he is mindless. This, if you know anything about D&D Aboleths, you know that they mind control people. And this is a mind-controlled slave. And because he is being mind-controlled, he cannot be commanded by normal leadership. He has to be commanded by magical leadership, because he's literally being directed telepathically what to do. And then lastly, there is undead leadership, which is the same thing, except for undead. Now, undead leadership also covers demons, I believe. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'm pretty sure undead leadership also is how you command demons. Okay, let's get into these abilities here. So almost every unit in the game has some sort of abilities, which are unique things that are particular to that unit. And there are a lot of different abilities that units can have. But let's look at what this one has in particular. So this one is an amphibian. So in Dominions, the world is separated into provinces. And there are water provinces. And amphibian means that this guy can travel between both water and land provinces with absolutely no issue. It just doesn't matter to him which one he's in, which is a very strong ability. Water nations are a big headache to a lot of the land nations, because the water nations have amphibious troops that can strike out from the water, but the land nations don't have amphibious troops and can't fight back, basically. They can't go into the water to bring the fight to the water nations. So amphibian is a big deal. Big deal. Kind of controversial in the community, actually. A lot of people don't like the dynamic of water nations in the game, but I digress. Dark vision, we already touched on a little bit. He ignores 50% of the penalties to being in the dark, which is cool. Very handy. That means that, and pretty much all of our troops have this, which means that if we're ever fighting in the dark, we're going to have an advantage, which means it's going to behoove us to try and make it so that we are fighting in the dark, and we have various methods of doing that. Anyway, he's also a taskmaster +1, which means he gets +1. He gives +1 morale to the slaves that he is commanding. And he is also a slave, because he may be a commander, but that doesn't mean he's not a slave to the Aboleths as well. So, Slave Prince He is a slave. Now, slave have very low morale, but they're boosted in morale when led by taskmasters. But the best part of the slave tag is that slaves have halved upkeep cost. Now, everything in the game has an upkeep cost. So this guy costs 32 gold a year. Now, if he wasn't a slave, he would cost us significantly more than that, twice as much, which means these guys are cheap. In fact, pretty much all of our troops that we can recruit are extremely cheap on the upkeep because they are all slaves. So that is the big bonus of playing Relay. Well, one of them anyway. Let's see. What else do I need to cover? Oh, magic, of course. So magic. You can see here in his abilities section, he has this little water droplet with a 2 next to it. That means he is a level 2 water mage and a level 1 astral mage. And this question mark here, if you click on it, you see whenever you recruit them, they have a 100% chance to gain 1 level in any of these 4 magical paths. So he can get +1 to his water, gain a level of earth magic, +1 to his astral, or gain a level in nature magic. So this guy's very useful. He's also a slave, which means he's very cost efficient to upkeep. He's an amphibian. He's a mermaid guy. Anyway, we'll cover our national stuff later. But the very important thing is research. So this guy has a research ability of 13. It's actually going to be a little higher than that because it doesn't take into account the random path. But your research ability is determined by how powerful of a mage you are. Now, what does research do? Well, let me show you.